Hello and welcome to another 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks. I'm Mega of Mayaani Jewellery, and today I thought we'd explore part 2 of our journey across European jewelry traditions. You may recall in part 1, it was sort of like a map, really, of the different types of jewelry traditions which exist and existed across Europe, specifically before the Industrial Revolution. Today I thought we'd look at what some of these traditions all have in common, the sort of common thread lying or running through each of them. Let's begin, of course, with point number one. Now, first of all, across all of the European jewelry traditions, by and large, jewelry functioned as a form of protection. So, of course, some of you may be familiar with the evil eye, for example. That has been a very classic and powerful symbol for protection across Mediterranean Europe in particular. It was seen across Greek and Roman amulets, is also later made its way into Byzantine jewelry, and it's still very prevalent across Southern Europe as well as in Middle Eastern culture too. So this evil eye was essentially a symbol that people would wear because they believed that the envy of another person could actually cause you harm. So someone having envious thoughts about you or towards you could actually bring about harm in your life. So they would wear these symbols to protect themselves from that. Another example is coral. Coral was worn in Europe specifically by women who were new mums and by children, because coral itself, the material, the stone, was thought to carry properties of protection and also life force energy. So in the case of coral, it was not so important how artistically the pieces were created. The craftsmanship was not the important focus. It was actually the coral, the stone itself, that gave you the protection. But essentially, we can see how across European traditions, jewelry traditions, essentially people didn't just wear jewelry, they actually trusted it. They trusted the jewelry that they were wearing to provide them with protection. So jewelry was much more meaningful and powerful than just something you put on to beautify yourself. Now, point number two, I'm referring to notes as you can see. Jewelry across European jewelry traditions was a declaration of love. It was a way to communicate very powerfully, very visually, the connection, the undying, never ending, eternal bond you shared with the person that you love. Examples of this were, of course, Posy rings. Now, Posy rings were rings that were plain gold band that would be exchanged between two people who were getting married, and they would contain an inscription on the inner side of the ring that would make contact with the skin of the person wearing the wedding ring. And essentially, this inscription was very private because only the person wearing the ring would see it. The inscriptions were typically in Latin or Middle French, and there'd be very short poetic lines or declarations of love, like "I'm always yours" or "Love conquers all." Little short phrases like that. So that's one example. Of course, another example is Gimmel rings. Now, Gimmel rings were either 2 or 3 rings that were separate, that couples who were engaged or betrothed to be married would wear on separate fingers, they'd wear them separately until their wedding day. On their wedding day, those rings, the 2 or 3 rings, were then brought together. Once they'd said their vows and they were now married, they were brought together on your wedding ring finger. And essentially, the rings completed each other. So you couldn't wear one without the other. They were seen as completing each other. Another example is feed rings. Feed rings featured on the actual ring a pair of hands clasping each other in a handshake, essentially. And these rings were very popular in Roman times, then made their way through Europe into Irish claddagh traditions. I may not be pronounced that correctly, apologies if not, but Irish claddagh traditions. And essentially, this handshake was a way to show your pledge, how you're pledging your commitment to each other, and essentially the symbol was seen to carry continue that bond, to carry the weight of that bond across 1,000 years. So you can see quite quickly how jewelry acted not just as protection, as we mentioned in point number one, but also number two, acted as a very powerful way for you to declare your love for another person and to demonstrate your commitment towards that person as well across the ages, across time and distance, actually, as well, as we will come to see in the case of. I'm just checking if in the case of hair jewelry. I'll mention it here briefly, actually. So hair jewelry was also a way to declare your love, but this was a bit different in the sense that it would communicate the bond that you both held across distance and even death. So essentially, it wasn't just hair jewelry, the brooches and rings as well created in lockets. But essentially, these pieces would contain a lock of hair from the person that you love. And this would essentially, just by wearing a physical part of them on your body, you would essentially be seen to be in deep or strong connection with them across distance and even across death. There we go. So moving on to number three. Now, jewelry was a very social and political form of communication across European traditions. Before we started being able to mass communicate, before communication became so easy, we could communicate messages across long distances very rapidly. Before that time, jewelry was a very visual and powerful way for you to communicate not just who you are, but where your allegiances lay, where your loyalties lie. And people would deliberately wear pieces of jewelry to show their allegiance, their loyalty to a particular royal house, for example. And this might work in their favor in some cases and could actually save their lives, making that political declaration. In some cases, it would not work in their favor, as you can imagine, because it depends on who you've come across and what their political beliefs are as well. Alongside communicating your political beliefs, they were used in society. Jewelry was used in society as a way to communicate um, social events taking place in your life. So if you're in a period of mourning, you lost a loved one, then specific types of jewelry would be worn whilst you are grieving to almost wear your grief openly. So you're wearing your grief, you're not trying to disguise it. You're wearing it in a way that people can see you're in that grieving phase of your life. And it was seen as a very dignified way of wearing your grief as well, of carrying your grief, if you like. So that was another example of how jewelry acted as a very social and political language across European traditions. But interestingly, there are two more examples. Sumptuary laws. Now, fascinatingly, jewelry was so powerful as a tool for communicating socially and politically messages that you wanted to share that governments actually felt the need to create laws, sumptuary laws, to control the jewelry. Essentially, the governments created these laws to dictate who could wear what pieces of jewelry when and why. Specifically, they were focused a lot on the materials. So pearls, gold, certain types of fur were restricted. Was restricted. You could not wear them unless you were the very elite social class in your society. So they deliberately went about controlling the materials and the types of pieces of jewelry that people were wearing because jewelry was such a powerful way to communicate socially and politically. And then, of course, you had guilds come into existence as well across Europe. And as they came into existence, the guild masters would have their own marks that they'd put on pieces of jewelry they'd created. And essentially, to wear a piece of jewelry created by a guild master was to wear their reputation on you. So essentially, to be able to wear a piece of jewelry made by a guild master, depending on that guild master's reputation, would be seen as elevating yourself in society. You're suddenly seen as very cultured. And it could get you into positions of high influence and high power just through having pieces like that in your possession. So you can see how jewelry was not just A, protection, B, a declaration of love and commitment, but also, thirdly, a way to communicate socially and politically in a very visual and powerful way at a time when it was not so easy to communicate some of these things in any other way. And you didn't want to have to necessarily speak every time, and no one's going to sit there listening to you go on for a while about what you believe and what your values are every single time you meet a person. So by wearing pieces of jewelry that do that for you, you took away a lot of that. They immediately understood so much about you just by looking at the pieces of jewelry you were wearing. Four, jewelry acted as a marker of time. Now, we all are probably familiar with this because it's not just in European jewelry traditions that this is the case. It's across many jewelry traditions across the world, but essentially specific pieces of jewelry would be received by a person to mark certain milestone moments in their life. A big example in European traditions is christening gifts. When a baby was born, they would receive gifts to celebrate their christening. When they were, baptized in the church that they were going to be baptized in, they'd receive these christening gifts, and particularly coral gifts for the wealthier families. They would invest in coral teething rings, coral baby rattles, coral gifts. The wealthy families would invest in, which ties in with the fact that coral was seen as protection for children. It's seen as an embodiment of life force or carrying life forces and seen as a protective charm. And then the larger masses of society, not the wealthy elite classes, the other classes of society would typically invest in either silver spoons or silver amulets. And so they'd give this gift, this christening gift, to mark this milestone moment in this newborn baby's life. Later on, of course, young women, for example, when they came of age, they would receive their first significant piece of jewelry that marked that transition from being a girl to now being a young woman. People would also wear specific types of jewelry to mark, as I mentioned before, mourning. So when they're going through a period of mourning, they would specifically in Britain wear jet. It's a type of stone I'd never really heard of. It's a black stone. And Whitby Yorkshire jet in particular was very famous and very popular. Anyway, jet would be worn by a person who's undergoing a period of mourning, and it was seen as a very, as I mentioned previously, dignified way to carry your grief, and a very visible way, so people would immediately know that you're grieving. And I suppose in a way it's a nice thing, because by wearing your grief overtly that way without you having to say you're grieving, people would just be able to notice you're grieving because you're wearing that jet stone. They would then be able to support you better, I imagine, as well, because how they'd approach you, how they'd speak to you, there would be that slight change to how they'd do that, because they're suddenly aware that you're going through a particular phase in your life, which we can all identify with at some point or another. We'll all go through it. So I think that particular point is quite nice. And then, of course, wedding rings. Wedding rings we're all familiar with. They're a very global phenomenon now. Wearing a wedding band was not necessarily present in all cultures, but it pretty much is now. And essentially, these wedding rings were a way for you to visually communicate the undying, everlasting bond between two people who are now bonded to each other through marriage. And the reason why these rings are worn on the ring finger, the wedding ring finger, was because it's actually a Roman belief that a major vein runs from that particular wedding ring finger directly to your heart. So this is why the wedding ring will be worn on that particular finger. Fascinatingly for me, and I've got to look into it a bit more, but in Indian custom, prior to the change to the left hand, I believe, and it may still be the case, Indian weddings would involve wearing your wedding ring on your right hand ring finger, not the left hand ring finger. So I'm curious to know when that change actually happened, when we all started generally wearing our wedding ring on our left hand ring finger, and whether that is still a widespread thing. I mean, I think majority of people do, but are there some cultures in which we still wear it on the right hand ring finger? I'll look into that. Anyway, 5, jewelry was seen as a spiritual bridge. So this may not come as a surprise to you. Jewelry has been worn for religious and spiritual reasons for a long time. Arguably, the oldest reason for us wearing jewelry was to do with protection, most likely, but spirituality is in there too. So people would actually see wearing certain pieces of jewelry as a way for you to directly connect yourself with the divine. So an example of this would be reliquary pendants. They would be pendants that contained the ashes of the bones of a saint, or even cloth that had touched sacred sites, or soil from Jerusalem. They would contain some kind of sacred content in this pendant that you would wear on your person, and through wearing it, you were seen to have a direct connection with the divine just through wearing this piece of jewelry. Other examples are pilgrimage badges. They would typically be made out of lead or pewter, and they were so metals, lead and pewter, obviously lesser metals, but yes, they were made out of lead and pewter, or pewter, and they were stamped with a particular saint, whether it's their face or their name or their initial. It would be stamped with the details of a particular saint, and you'd collect them from pilgrimage sites. Once you made the pilgrimage to the site, you'd collect one of these, and you'd collect them for two reasons. First of all, to wear it to show your continued bond with that particular saint and devotion and loyalty to that saint, but secondly, also as proof of your journey to the pilgrimage site. So so yes, we know how sometimes these things can get very not so much political, but a bit competitive. You kind of, you want to show that you've been to this place and done this pilgrimage, and there's very much an ego play there. But yes, we do have that happen even today. People kind of having these big discussions about how much more devoted they are than someone else, simply through comparing, like in this case, how many pilgrimage badges they have. But yes, that was one too. And finally, astral jewelry. So there were rings and pendants that had specific gemstones in them, which are believed to carry planetary properties. So, for example, ruby was considered to carry the planetary properties of the sun, which isn't a planet technically, but yes, it's a solar body. And then, of course, a sapphire was seen to be a stone that carried the planetary properties of Jupiter. Pearls were seen to carry the planetary properties of the moon, which again technically is a satellite, but you know what I mean. So essentially, you'd wear these pieces of jewelry with these specific gemstones to align yourself with a particular body, a cosmic body, with a particular, whether it's a planet, a solar body, or a satellite, you'd connect yourself, align yourself with that particular planet, for want of a better word, through wearing that particular piece. So you can see how, and finally, devotional rings. Let me mention those as well briefly. Devotional rings. So these would contain a saint's initials, and you'd wear them on you for constant divine protection. You're probably familiar with, there is the is it Saint Patrick, the patron saint of travelers? There's a patron saint of travelers who may be Saint Patrick. Have to Don't quote me on that one. I need to check that again. But essentially, a lot of people when going on big journeys or voyages would wear a pendant with his initials on them, or even a stamped sort of a depiction of him, as a form of protection to protect them on this journey they're going to go on, almost believing that by wearing it they're getting safe passage. So devotional rings act in the same way. So we can quite clearly see that jewelry across many European traditions, irrespective of those traditions, had one or more of these threads running through it. Whatever the European tradition was, it would have one or more ties to one or more of these particular reasons why people were wearing the jewelry. So jewelry was not just aesthetic; it was not just something you wore to beautify yourself. And I think I had a question at the end of this. I'm just going to have a little look and see. Yes, what I wanted to say was, of course, we continue to buy pieces of jewelry to this day, and we still do buy them and invest in them to mark crucial moments in our life, crucial milestones, including crucial moments like getting married, engagements, births, deaths as well. People do create memorial rings. It's quite common for people to have resin rings made at the moment with the ashes of a loved one, including pets. So people still have these commemorative pieces or symbolic pieces created to mark specific moments and milestones in their life. But the question is, do we actually think about the weight these pieces carry in our lives? Do they still carry the same weight they once carried when we wore them, in the times when our connection to jewelry and its meaning was so much stronger than it is now? Of course, in the case of memorial rings, I believe we do, because when you have the ashes of a loved one preserved in a ring for you, without a shadow of a doubt, you are feeling the weight of that connection. But by and large, most of the other pieces of jewelry that we invest in, do we actually think about that? Do we actually think about them from the point of view of how deeply meaningful and personal these pieces are to us, how well they capture us and our story and our relationship with the person that we might be sharing them with, in the case of wedding rings, for example, or engagement rings? Or do we look largely at the surface aesthetics? Do we tend to focus too much on the price tag? Oh, I must spend this much on this because then it's seen as being worthy if I spent a certain amount on it. Or it must be made out of certain materials, because only if it's made out of certain materials is it now considered to be worthy of carrying, the symbol of our marriage, for example, or our union. Do we actually place too much focus and concern on perhaps the wrong areas and aspects of the jewelry, rather than the aspects and areas of the jewelry that actually make them deeply personal and meaningful and more powerful ultimately, irrespective of the price tag and what they're made of? So I'd love to know your thoughts. Of course, if you've enjoyed this little part 2 tour of jewelry traditions across Europe, I welcome you to share with me any of your thoughts and comments below. I cannot wait to be with you in the next one, in which we'll be exploring jewelry traditions across Asia. I left it for last on purpose. That was intentional, because being Indian, of course, Asia is where you might think I would begin. But no, I thought I must start by looking at other parts of the world and then come back to Asia and focusing on seeing how jewelry traditions existed and continue to exist across Asia. And then looking at all of these traditions across different parts of the world and ultimately building a picture of how essentially all these traditions have the same powerful underlying message behind them. So anyway, I will love you and leave you on that note. If you've enjoyed this particular video, please do hit the like button. Of course, you are welcome to subscribe so that you can stay in touch with me and keep tabs on more content I bring out, which is all focused on making us more conscious and intentional when it comes to our jewelry choices. And the notification bell will let you know when my next video is out. Remember, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought, and I will be back again soon. Bye for now.